So today is lesson 5 on tissues, and we will spend a little bit of time going over those tissues. And we have categories for those: epithelial, and the epithelial cells would be linings of organs. They can come in two big categories: sheets or masses. Connective tissue, your muscular tissue, and your nervous tissue. And in this lesson 5, we're going to be spending all of our time on just the epithelial tissue. And I'm going to move now to the PowerPoint that's in Google Classroom. So this is the PowerPoint that I'll be going over that's in Google Classroom and attached with the Screencastify. And as I just showed you on my little whiteboard, we have 4 classes of tissues: the epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous system. And when I was taking anatomy, I learned a lot of what I call mnemonics, or easy ways to, or tricks to remember categories and things that maybe didn't make a lot of sense in my head right then. And so my mnemonic for tissues was C, men, C for your connective tissue, M for muscular, E for your epithelial, and N for your nervous tissue. And the epithelial tissue can be broken up into 5 categories. And the next slide actually shows you pictures of those. And so once we go through the different types of tissues, I think when you see the picture of them, it'll make a little bit more sense. Simple epithelial and can be broken up into squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And our simple epithelial cells are for absorption and secretion and filtration. They're a single layer, they are very thin, it's not for protection. And they're often under connective tissue, which will be lesson 6. The simple squamous tissue is thin, it's often very permeable. And when you think of things that are permeable or absorb, automatically you should recognize that that cannot make up what we want for our skin tissue, because it would not keep us waterproof. And so our simple squamous is often permeable, and it's where we have rapid filtration. And I'm going to take just a moment, and I want to have you stop and think, even though we're very early on in the anatomy class, just using your background knowledge and general life, where in the human body would we want filtration to occur? And it also can be an exchange. Think of it as not just filtration, but an exchange. And I'll give you a moment to think about that. So you may not know it at this point, but the kidneys are a large filter organ. That's always strange. I remember when the first time I heard that it was a filter organ, and thinking that my mother often eats liver and onions as a meal, I was thinking, if it's filtering things, then what it means that the organ itself is a filtration organ, and I'm not sure I would be wanting to eat something that filters, and yet the liver is actually very high in nutrients. And so the other area that you might have thought about was the lungs, where we have the gas exchange that has to happen very quickly, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The cuboidal and columnar epithelial tissue are linings where we need what I would consider to be moisture or fluid. At least that's how you would probably perceive it to be. So the cuboidal cells are by shape, they're cubes, and the columnar is again by shape, they're columns. And if you take a look at the simple, and then down here I have stratified. The stratified, all that means is it's more than one layer of this tissue. So pseudostratified is a fake, so it's not true solid layers of columns. Instead, it would be layers of columns with maybe other pieces squished in between. So again, our squamous tends to be a like unorganized looking tissue. And we will be spending a little bit of time in a lab activity where we will be looking at slides of the squamous and the cuboidal and the columnar. And one of the things that I find interesting the first time students look at real slides of this tissues is that they're so used to a textbook that gives you a picture of just one type of cell. And the simplest is you're looking at an animal cell or a plant cell. And for some of you who have had maybe a little bit higher education as far as science is concerned already, you would have known that there were other types of cells or very specific types of cells. And what will be confusing to you is that you're used to seeing a slide of just a cuboidal cell and then flipping and having a slide of just squamous and then flipping a slide and just seeing columnar and drawing pictures or taking photographs with your iPhone on the microscope that way. Whereas now you're going to get something more realistic, where you're going to get a slide that will have multiple types of tissue on it. Because if you think of the human body, in the nose, for example, I'm going to need one layer of tissue that releases fluid and mucus. I'm going to need a different layer behind that. I'm going to need connective tissue as well. So this is the first time you're going to see slides with multiple different types of cells on them. So the stratified layers are nothing more than what our simple layers are, but at least 2 layers of that tissue. The transitional, then, when you start thinking about that, makes sense in that if we are going from a cuboidal to a columnar to an epithelial, simple epithelial, I might need a transitional piece that holds it all together. And then our last type of epithelial tissue is your glandular. And so that just a little bit more makes sense. We have 2 categories of glands, our endocrine and our exocrine, and glandular epithelial tissue will be making those glands up. And here's the slide that hopefully will make the types of our epithelial tissue a little bit more sense. Here you see the squamous, and it's thin single layer. Remember I told you, and because of that it's not a protective layer. And it's like a mishmash. It's not nice and even. So squamous is more of a sort of a messy type cell. And the dark spots, of course, they're depicting the nucleuses of those cells. What I don't like about this picture is that it's showing that nice nucleus right in the center of the cells, and traditionally that is not necessarily where the nucleus is. And in the slides that you're going to see in our lab activity, for the first time you're going to see that you can have 2 nucleuses in one cell because it's preparing for division. Or you might see a nucleus at one end of a cell and at the opposite end of the cell, and that's truly more realistic for you. So here is our cuboidal cells, and those are nice cubes, a single layer, because it's simple. Here we have our simple columnar, nice columns. And although you're seeing multiple ones here, it's just one layer. And here I have my stratified squamous. So, excuse me, we're a fast one there. Here we have the sort of messy, but here for the first time they're showing you also cuboidal on that. So this is your squamous cells. Here are my stratified cuboidal at more than one layer of cubes. My pseudo-stratified columnar, where they're not all pure columns. And I could have a second type of tissue here where I would have 2 layers of columnar, and that would be my stratified columnar. So again, your epithelial tissue comes in 2 forms, either as a nice sheet attached to each other or as a mass. And the sheets are those very specific areas where we need to have a very specific function, and they are for our mucous membranes, linings of the respiratory tract, the digestive tract, urinary and reproductive. Reproductive tract because we need vaginal secretions and penile secretions as well. In the respiratory tract, you're used to, if you have a cold, having a lot of mucus fluid in there, but the respiratory tract always has some fluid within that respiratory area, or your lung would be so dry it cannot open and close easily. And the digestive tract, if you don't have enough fluid in that large intestine, what happens is a person becomes constipated. There's an interesting little paragraph here on the pleura of the walls of the thoracic cavity. And remember in our last section we talked about cranial, our thoracic, our abdominal cavities. And so here in the pleural or the thoracic cavity we're having the pleura, and that's the sides of the organ, or what lines the lungs. And in between those membranes, there's a very thin fluid, and that helps lubricate those lungs, and so they can actually move open and closing very easily against the rib cage. And you can have a couple big issues with that. You can have a pleurisy, which is it's an infection in that area. You have too much mucousy fluid in there, and what happens is that as a person is trying to breathe, too much fluid is there and is putting too much pressure on the lungs to be able to open and close easily. Pleurisy is very painful. And you also have a pneumothorax. And my son, I will give you a couple stories in between an anatomy. He retired military, but he would tell me that in the medical packs that would go out into the field with them, there was actually a pneumothorax valve. So what would happen is if a person took had a thoracic type injury, let's say that a bomb exploded nearby them, and they were the sound waves actually can compress the chest cavity and can cause bleeding in that chest cavity, and would make it very difficult for the lung to open and close. Or they might have had a knife wound, or a gunshot wound, or grenade particles, etc. So what happens is we have a pleural cavity space has been able to get an injury in there, and air is getting in there. The lung can't inflate. The person is actually going to die from lack of being able to breathe. And so they're trained to be able to insert that thin piece of the valve into that pleural cavity, release the valve, and the air comes out, and temporarily that lung will be very functional. So in general, the epithelial tissue is very important as far as it gives off the secretions of the body. It controls how permeable things are between different tissues of our body, allowing a blood exchange between capillaries and venules to veins, etc. And it gives us protection. And it also can give a great deal of sensation. Some of the areas of the body that have the most sensation have a great deal of epithelial tissue. Babies put everything up to their lips because it is one of the most innervated parts of the body. And so they're getting all of their sensation from the lip tissue. So what I want for today is for you to define the differences between simple, your stratified, the pseudostratified, and transitional. And what I would personally do is I would do a drawing of each and then make a couple sentences about the different types of tissue. So on the test that would be attached to the tissues, you will get images from the microscope lab, and you would be needing to define or identify where cuboidal cells were and giving a brief definition of those. And then I would also contrast the difference between squamous, the columnar, and cuboidal cells as far as not only their shape, but also their specific function. And that is where we will end for today. On our next lesson, we will be going through the other three forms of our tissue. Remember, if you use the mnemonic CMEN, this is the epithelial. Now we need to do the connective, the muscular, and the nervous tissue. Thank you.